fighter planes. If anything, that outrage has grown rather than having diminished, as is so often the case. There was also increasingly harsh rhetoric between the United States and the Soviet Union today, with the Soviets denying their planes shot down the jetliner, and the President of the United States accusing Moscow of lying.
What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings? What can be said about Soviet credibility when they so flagrantly lie about such a heinous act?
The intrusion into the airspace of this plane cannot be regarded as anything other than a pre-planned act.
No cover-up, however brazen and elaborate, can change this reality or absolve the Soviet Union of its responsibility to explain its behavior. The world is waiting for the Soviet Union to tell the truth.
There are reports tonight circulating in Washington, but as yet unconfirmed, that Soviet searchers have recovered several bodies in the water where the plane went down in the sea off the Soviet coast north of Japan. Again, that report unconfirmed by the White House. In San Francisco, attorney Melvin Belli and another lawyer filed a $99 billion lawsuit today against the Soviet Union and Korean Airlines on behalf of all 269 people, including 51 Americans, who died aboard the plane. That sense of outrage over the huge loss of life was evident today in demonstrations not only in this country but in other parts of the world as well. There were 200 at this street rally in London outside the Soviet embassy.
I cannot understand really how they could shoot.
In Seoul, in cities and in villages, grieving families of the dead passengers and crew. Demonstrations overseas and here in the United States.
We condemn this act as a grave violation of human rights.
This evening, President Reagan, after returning 3 days early from his California vacation, met with his national security advisors at the White House to discuss possible retaliation against the Soviet Union. A report on that now from White House correspondent Chris Wallace.
The president's top national security advisors leaving the White House tonight after a meeting that lasted 2 hours, twice the scheduled length. But the biggest decision tonight may have been one not to act. A senior administration official said the president is unlikely to approve any economic sanctions against the Soviets. The president also directed Secretary of State Shultz to go ahead with his long-scheduled meeting next week with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko. And the administration has all but ruled out a third major action, saying it is unlikely arms control talks will be cut off. What the president is considering, spokesman Larry Speake said after the meeting, is a, quote, measured response, designed to prevent a recurrence of this kind of incident. Speaks hinted at 3 possible actions: an international agreement to ensure the safety of air travel, an international ban on Soviet airline flights, and a demand for the Soviets to pay financial compensation to the families of victims. The president was apparently finding it easier to talk tough to the Soviets than to act tough. Today in California, before returning to the White House, Mr. Reagan called the Soviet attack an act of terrorism, and he said that Soviet officials are lying about what happened.
What can be the scope of legitimate mutual discourse with a state whose values permit such atrocities? And what are we to make of a regime which establishes one set of standards for itself and another for the rest of humankind? The brutality of this act should not be compounded through silence or the cynical distortion of the evidence now at hand.
The president will get a final list of recommendations from top aides tomorrow night. He will then meet with congressional leaders on Sunday, while his administration consults with foreign officials. Sometime after that, the president will announce what aides hope will be a demonstration of world outrage against the Soviet Union. John?
The Soviet news agency TASS today came out with its first explanation of just what happened. The Soviet Union did not admit that its fighters shot down the jumbo jet, saying the jetliner left Soviet airspace and disappeared from the view of its own jet fighters after warning shots were fired. This prompted an angry Secretary of State Schultz to make an immediate reply. First, the Soviet statement as shown on Russian television.
The intruder plane had deviated from the existing international route in the direction of the Soviet Union's territory by up to 500 kilometers and spent more than 2 hours over the Kamchatka Peninsula, the area of the Sea of Okhotsk and the island of Sakhalin. In violation of international regulations, the plane flew without navigation lights, did not react to radio signals of the Soviet dispatcher services, and made no attempt to establish such communications contact. It was natural that during the time the unidentified intruder plane was in the USSR airspace, Soviet anti-air defense aircraft were ordered aloft, which repeatedly tried to establish contacts with the plane using generally accepted signals and to take it to the nearest airfield in the territory of the Soviet Union. The intruder plane, however, ignored all this. Over the Sakhalin Island, a Soviet aircraft fired warning shots and tracer shells along the flying route of the plane. Soon after this, the intruder plane left the limits of Soviet airspace and continued its flight toward the Sea of Japan. For about 10 minutes, it was within the observation zone of radio location means, after which it could be observed no more.
The Soviet Union has today issued another statement in its continuing effort to cover up the facts of the inhuman Soviet attack on an unarmed civilian airliner. They still will not admit the truth that they shot down an unarmed civilian aircraft. TASS also asserts that the Soviet aircraft fired warning shots with tracer shells along the route of the plane. We know the Soviet pilot reported that he had fired on the target and it was destroyed. There is no indication that the Soviets tried to warn the plane by firing tracers. The Soviet Union is clearly engaged in an effort to divert attention from its own actions by false claims of a U.S. intelligence connection with a Korean civilian airliner. None of this can obscure the facts. The Soviet Union must accept the responsibility for having shot down an unarmed commercial airliner, taking the lives of 269 human beings. No cover-up, however brazen and elaborate, can change this reality or absolve the Soviet Union of its responsibility to explain its behavior. The world is waiting for the Soviet Union to tell the truth.
And today at the United Nations Security Council, the United States delegate and the representative of the Soviet Union exchanged harsh words over the shooting down of the airliner, and one of the bitterest exchanges there since the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis more than 20 years ago. UN correspondent Beverly Byer has this report.
There were discussions before the debate. Diplomats were aware of 5 demands by the Republic of Korea: a full account of what happened, an apology and compensation for the families of dead passengers, punishment of those responsible, an investigation by an impartial international organization, and guarantees that this won't happen again. Speaking for the United States, Ambassador Charles Lichtenstein was tough.
Let us call the crime for what clearly it is: wanton, calculated, deliberate murder. In its refusal to admit the truth, it is lying openly, brazenly, knowingly. In so doing, it is ironically showing its true face to the world, the face that it's so often hidden behind the peace offensive, behind the propaganda machinery, behind its talk of brotherhood and human solidarity and international coexistence. It is the face of a ruthless totalitarian state A state which has been responsible over the past 6.5 decades for killing more people. The latest estimate I have read is between 70 and 80 million, and enslaving more nations than any state, any regime in the history of mankind. A state that tailors its concept of truth to what will advance its own interests, that and nothing else. A state that does not accept responsibility for a minimally decent international order. A state whose ultimate objective is to remake the world in its own image.
The Soviet ambassador, Richard Ovinikov, did not admit or apologize for the incident. Instead, he accused the Reagan administration of mounting a crusade against communism for its own reasons.
If we were to summarize in one sentence, the reason for today's ignominious step show, we could say the following. The U.S. administration wishes to obtain yet another pretext to justify its irresponsible policy through the preparation for nuclear war. In playing with categories of morality, there is an attempt to use these for the most immoral actions in the history of mankind, to justify a policy of thermonuclear world war.
But the U.S. didn't buy the Soviet sidestep. Ambassador Lichtenstein returned to the basic question.
Why, I must ask the Soviet representative, why did you shoot down the airplane?
There are 15 members on the Security Council. In order to pass a resolution condemning the Soviets, 9 countries must vote for it. Arithmetic shows the going will be tough. The Soviets won't vote to punish themselves, nor will 3 other pro-Soviet countries, Poland, Nicaragua, and Zimbabwe. And there are others who are undecided. Even with enough votes, the Soviets have veto power, which erases the official condemnation, but not the political humiliation. And to accomplish that, the U.S. needs more proof. The debates will continue, and one U.S. source told NBC News that the tapes of the Soviet pilot conversations may even be introduced as evidence here to show that the Soviet action was deliberate and malicious. Beverly Byer, NBC News, the United Nations.
As we've seen, this airliner tragedy has involved military intelligence, bitter diplomatic exchanges, and a worldwide public outcry. Tonight, we want to call in several NBC News correspondents to talk about some of the unanswered questions. Marvin Kalb at the State Department, James Compton in London, Phil Bremen in Frankfurt, and Chris Wallace at the White House. Let's first go to Marvin Kalb. Marvin, we have heard a lot of bitter exchanges today between the United States and the Soviet Union. How serious do you estimate this breach is, and what are the consequences?
Well, I have been astonished, frankly, as I've been observing this over the last couple of days, how bitter the rhetoric has become. And it's exceedingly difficult when 2 superpowers begin to yell at each other in the manner in which they are, to see a summit meeting between Reagan and Andropov anytime in the next 18 months, to see a major arms control agreement between the 2 powers, to see a resumption of the improvement in diplomatic relations. We do know that the Secretary of State is going to be meeting next week, that is the current plan, with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko in Madrid, but the context there is a human rights context. People wanted to think about an improvement in relations among 35 different countries, and yet we are told here that the major topic of conversation is now going to be the plane. So that the shooting down of that plane by the Soviet Union has now worsened relations between the 2 superpowers in a very significant way.
Thank you, Marvin. Let's switch now over to Jim Compton in London. Jim, are the people in Europe as upset about this as certainly the people here in the United States are?
John, there's been universal condemnation of the shooting down of the Korean jetliner. But it must be said that that condemnation is tempered by the concern that is felt so keenly in Europe that superpower conflict must not get out of hand. 4 countries called in the Soviet ambassadors to their country today. In each case, the ambassadors were given scorching questioning about exactly what happened. But afterwards, each country stopped short of recommending any specific sanctions against the Soviet Union. It must be said there is severe skepticism being expressed about the United States' performance in this. Tonight, 2 British TV commentators said, if American intelligence is so very good, why did the United States not intervene? And they also asked, why did the hotline not work? So in Europe, there is deep concern, deep condemnation, but also concern that superpower conflict not get out of hand.
Thank you, Jim Compton, reporting there from London. We apologize for a little bit of video technical difficulty we had. Let's try Frankfurt now and bring in Phil Bremen. Phil, what has this done, this outcry about the plane going down? What has this done to the peace groups there, the anti-nuclear groups in Europe that have been so vocal?
John, it's the worst thing that could possibly have happened to them, we suspect. The Soviet Union had gone to a great deal of effort to convince the world, and Western Europe in particular, that the Soviets were peace-minded and humanitarian. Now the Soviets themselves appear to have canceled all that out with a single gesture. The peace movement, which was gaining wide public support and exerting great pressure on all the governments in Western Europe that were scheduled to deploy new Pershing II and cruise missiles as early as 3 months from now finds itself scuttled, if you will. The governments will have renewed confidence to go ahead with those plans. Ironically, some West German intellectuals at a demonstration a few hours ago told me the incident with the airliner may in fact point up an even more urgent need for cooling down the arms race instead of accelerating it. Their argument goes like this: the Soviets made this terrible mistake after thinking about it for 2.5 hours. A Pershing II, once installed in West Germany, would take less than 10 minutes to reach Soviet soil. What sort of judgment would you expect of the Soviets under those circumstances?
Thank you, Phil Bremen, reporting from Frankfurt. Now let's go to the White House and Chris Wallace. Chris, in your report a little while ago, you talked about a lot of tough talk, but I gather from your report we can't expect very much tough action from the White House.
Well, you know, John, there is a contradiction. The president talks about the Soviets engaging in terrorist acts and flagrant lies at the same time that his aides say that they want a measured response. In fact, in the last 2 days, the fact of the matter is that the administration has talked a great deal more about what it won't do than what it will do. Economic sanctions, unlikely. A cutoff of arms talks, unlikely. I can't help but think what candidate Reagan would have made of a president acting like this, how much he criticized Jimmy Carter in 1980 for not standing up to the Soviets. And I think it just goes to show that the world is a great deal more complicated when you're here at the White House than when you're out on the campaign trail.
Chris, again, when can we expect the president to announce his decision, what action he's going to take?
He's going to get a final list of recommendations tomorrow night. He's going to meet with congressional leaders on Sunday. They say not to expect any announcements until after that congressional meeting.
Thank you, Chris. And so tonight, after a day of public and official outrage over the shooting down of an unarmed commercial jetliner, there is doubt about what action the United States, other countries, and the United Nations can or will take in an effort to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. Even the central question of why it happened remains unanswered tonight. This Labor Day weekend, President Reagan will meet with congressional leaders and continue to study his options in a series of meetings with his advisors. The UN Security Council has adjourned until Tuesday. In the meantime, memorial services will be held in this country, in Korea, and in Japan.